All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Building on Bitcoin virtual event. My name is Andre Serrano. I work at product at Stacks Foundation. I'm joined here by Elena Herald, who leads product marketing at Hero Systems, and Janus, who is the founder of the Bitcoin Layers project, as well as the creator of Bitcoin Rollups.io. We just heard his talk on some of the basics of rollups and Bitcoin L2s. And today, this panel is going to go a little bit deeper to explore some of the topics that he already started to talk about. We'll be going over the different Bitcoin layers categories. We'll explore some of the trade-offs and the approaches that some of these projects are taking, and how you, as the user of this technology, should really start to evaluate some of these Bitcoin layers. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. Elena, I'm going to come over to you for this first question. I'd love if we can kick things off just at a high level. So why are Bitcoin layers needed, and why do you think that people are so excited to build on Bitcoin L2s right now?
Thanks, Andre. Happy to be here. So yeah, why are Bitcoin layers needed? There's two main properties that people look for in Bitcoin layers. One is increased functionality and increased scalability. But if you wanted increased functionality, increased scalability, you could just go to a separate blockchain. So the second element of Bitcoin layers is having a place that gives you increased functionality and increased scalability while inheriting those amazing security and liquidity properties that Bitcoin has. So that's essentially why Bitcoin layers are needed. And then the reason why people are really jazzed about it right now, I think we've heard about that all day today. So there were two main innovations in the past 24 months that have gotten people really excited about new ways that you can use the Bitcoin L1. Ordinals was a really playful and engaging and super successful demonstration of how meta protocols can bring fungible and non-fungible tokens onto the Bitcoin L1. And then BitVM, which Janus was talking about quite a bit in his presentation. So it's a clever way of minimizing trust and getting the Bitcoin L1 to kind of verify off-chain claims.
All right, and Janus, anything to add to that?
No, I would just echo that it's a really exciting time, and I think there's a lot of interesting technological approaches. I'm also interested in protocols that don't necessarily want to be like quote unquote a Bitcoin rollup and are looking at other designs, whether it be building on Ethereum and having some bridge protocol between the execution layer and Bitcoin, or building like a new Tendermint like Cosmos chain, and again having like that bridge protocol with Bitcoin, but having like some way that BTC, the asset, can act as like a security mechanism for the chain. So I think like rollups are really cool. I've obviously been looking at them for like the last couple of years, but also I think these new execution layers and strategies that are coming to market are also super interesting, and think people should be open-minded about the entire thing. So I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, definitely. So we have all of these new use cases that are coming back to Bitcoin. I think that people are also starting to realize just the large market opportunity that exists with this asset class. So we're dealing with a $1.2 trillion asset class that has still very little on-chain uses, very little existing applications, and yet there is just a blue ocean of opportunities that we can start to explore to make Bitcoin a more productive asset. And so I think that's really starting to generate a lot of this enthusiasm that we're seeing. Now, Janus, I want to come over to you next. So you've been looking across the Bitcoin layers ecosystem and really starting to classify dozens of projects that we've been seeing pop up over the past year or so. And so how do you classify the current state of Bitcoin layers?
Yeah, so I think you have, there's a lot of different implementations. You have things from like CSV protocols, you have state chains, Lightning, you have federated applications like Fedimint and eCash, like Cashew. So you have this like wide array of solutions that are very focused on like solving the payments side of things that I think are very interesting and worthwhile, like are worth discussion, right? This new wave of like, Bitcoin scaling solutions are trying to model something similar to what Ethereum is. So but I think they do something a little bit different than Ethereum. Like if you look at the rollups on top of Ethereum that have some of the most users and some of the most like TVL, they're basically replicating the applications that already exist on the Ethereum L1. What's different about Bitcoin is that these new execution layers are providing Ethereum-like or Solana-like execution environments for users of BTC, the asset, right? So it's kind of, taking the scaling roadmaps from Ethereum and Celestia and trying to like blend that in with Bitcoin, providing more use cases for BTC. I would say the implementations of those designs are broken down into a couple of different things. Like you have things called sidechains, which are other consensus protocols, can be more integrated or unintegrated with Bitcoin depending on the implementation. And you typically have a two-way peg enshrined in the protocol that is securing the BTC. You have rollups, which are posting data to Bitcoin, which I just talked about, and additionally can have a trust minimized validating bridge. You also have these side chains that are specifically acting as settlement layers. So if you look at something like Side Protocol, their thesis is that we're going to be a settlement layer for rollups, and we're going to be the layer that integrates with Bitcoin in some form of fashion. And we're going to give the rollups and the applications the freedom to design their chains as like pseudo layer threes, if you want to call them that. I'm not sure if they're layer threes, but you have that type of implementation as well. And then you also have chains that are focused on being more like application layers, so things developing on Ethereum or Tendermint, and they're also looking to implement this trust minimized validating bridge or trust minimized bridge for the Bitcoin asset, and Bitcoin assets more generally. But yeah, they're using a different protocol for different security trade-offs versus something that would be more, I would say, directly integrated with Bitcoin per se.
Got it. So we're seeing a variety of projects launching, and it sounds like they're just making a range of different trade-offs in their design. Some that are essentially focusing more on scalability or maybe throughput improvements, whereas some we're seeing that are really focused on reducing those trust assumptions. And there's almost like a trade-off that you have to make in terms of how you are evaluating these sorts of protocols. Really interesting point there. I'd love to just drill into a couple of things that you guys have talked about. I know like through this conversation, we've heard terms like trust minimized bridging, and Yana, you talked before about terms like unilateral exit. Can you just help people really understand what we mean by these terms, and are there any other features that you think are important for Bitcoin L2s?
Yeah, so it's still a bit of a gray area, right? I wouldn't say that we've completely solved what this implementation of a trust minimized bridge is going to look like. I would say my understanding of BitVM2 is that anybody who's anybody can participate as a verifier in the program. So anybody can initiate if the operator is acting maliciously. Anybody can then go and challenge the operator and act as a verifier. This is very similar to like a fraud proof scheme that exists in something like Optimism or not Optimism, sorry, they're adding fraud proofs, but something like Arbitrum today, so like in Ethereum. And projects like Optimism are going to be adding fraud proofs here soon. So that I would say, as long as the role of acting, being able to initiate the challenge or submit the fraud proof is permissionless, I would say that that's pretty trust minimized. The other direction you might have is like having a consensus protocol manage like the two-way peg. So something, similar to like issuing a token and having that token have enough value to where that value, if I'm an operator of this two-way peg, and I'm acting maliciously, then my stake in this token will be slashed. And if the token is worth enough and is economically incentivizing me to act good, then I think those like mechanisms are also like kind of interesting. And I know people have been talking about that a little bit more lately. So those are like a couple of things like with regards to like trust minimized bridging. What we're really talking about with unilateral exit though is that like in both of those models, like there is some trust with the operator of the bridge protocol. I think, things like permissionless verification are really interesting because you're really minimizing that trust to a broader set of participants. But things like, for example, like unilateral exit, what that means is that if I lock my asset into the layer 2, that all I need to do is initiate an L1 transaction to exit the protocol. So when we talk about that, there's a couple of nuances there. Like, well, one, right now, it can be pretty expensive to do an L1 transaction, but I still think having that property and giving people that optionality is still important. But I think it also bodes to the fact that we also need to consider like what Ethereum is looking at right now, how to like decentralize block producers and decentralized provers, and make sure that there's decentralization and we're mitigating the risk for censorship and liveness failures in those systems. So, and even when we're looking at layer 2s and Bitcoin or sidechains or application layers, we need to think about how we decentralize trust to where we're not relying on single parties or small groups of people to permit withdrawals, to include transactions of blocks, etc.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Elena.
If I can jump in, yeah, I just want to go back to Alice from Jonas's presentation a few minutes ago. So in very plain, like simple terms, if Alice wants to drive on this magical bridge to Web3 land and she wants to take her Bitcoin with her, unilateral exit implies that she doesn't need anybody's permission to get off the bridge if something bad happens. In most of these designs, when we say things like sequencers or block proposers or bridges, what's happening in a decentralized system is that you have independent nodes, computer programs, protocols that are kind of like gating or running when different transactions happen. And so if you have all your trust in a bridge or in an L2, you're not inheriting the security of the L1. But if you can unilaterally exit, meaning you can just send a transaction to the Bitcoin L1 and get off the bridge and back to safety, that's a property that's really, really exciting for a lot of people. The flip side is just it's really hard to build. And so I think that's where a lot of the trade-offs are, is helping users understand what's possible in theory, what's in active development, and then what's actually on mainnet. The other kind of flip side with trust minimized bridging or kind of understanding risks and trust assumptions, and shout out to the Bitcoin Layers project. They have done a great job so far, kind of adding to the general knowledge base of like these universally understood terms. But the flip side is like, if you have a sufficiently decentralized sidechain, then when you're talking about trust assumptions, it's true, you have to trust a different set of operators or a different set of nodes and validators on another chain. But you might have, just as good decentralized trust assumptions because those operators are sufficiently decentralized. So it's a lot of moving pieces. And I think, yeah, that's why using Alice and the bridge metaphor are really helpful. It's just unilateral exit means getting off the bridge and back to safety without having to ask for permission. And kind of how that bridge is constructed is part of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really clear way to explain that, Elena. And just to like double click on one thing, I think that one of the limitations of building on Bitcoin right now is that it doesn't have smart contracts, right? It doesn't have a way to verify those L2 state transitions the way that Ethereum can, for example. So from your perspective, or maybe Janusz, do you think that Bitcoin needs an upgrade or needs future upgrades to the Bitcoin L1 in order to actually see some of these L2s develop in the way that you have described?
Yeah, I would say, I would point to a recent article from Shinobi in Bitcoin Magazine on CatVM, and also the Bitcoin Rollups.org white paper to talk about two upgrades, like a recursive covenant and something like an OP snark verify. So a verifier in the L1 that could, verify like ZK snarks. I think things like that are interesting and worth discussing.
Awesome. Okay, and we're just about coming up on time here, so I want to give you both an opportunity to just share any concluding thoughts that you have, or maybe some ideas for where things might be headed in the future for Bitcoin Layers. Let's start with you, Janusz, and we'll let Elena close things out.
Yeah, I think ultimately, right, I think we're in an extremely new design space. And I think even when you look at places like Ethereum that have been working on these things for like, a number of years, there are still all these arguments around definitions and the most secure implementation of an L2, et cetera. And I would just say like there are a lot of really like these types of activities and exercises are really good to get the information out. But I think what's even more valuable is there are a lot of communities out there, via Telegram, Discord, other Signal, other chat communities where people are actively discussing these things in the open and not acting like everyone has it all figured out. So being able to enter these communities and really enter a mode of discovery and kind of try to realize what's possible and how to analyze all these different these implementations in isolation of each other. So I think things like that are really interesting. I would definitely recommend, the BitVM Builders Telegram group, Rollups on Bitcoin. And then additionally, we're hosting a Telegram group called Documenting Bitcoin Layers, where teams are very active in trying to figure out what these different designs and trust assumptions are. And yeah, and if keep everything open source as well, because if we might, get something wrong. And if we do, just, yeah, correct us on it. So those are my thoughts. Pass it over to Elena.
Yeah, plus one, echo everything that John has said, particularly building an open source. One of the coolest things about this industry, and particularly about Bitcoin, is that we can build our values into the technology itself. And, you know, we talk about all these definitions, like who really cares? Does it actually make a difference to the end user? I think of like the car metaphor a lot. People really want faster cars. They didn't really ask for seatbelts. And having really thoughtful and engaging discussions and debates around like what are adequate trust assumptions for the next generation of the world's financial rails. I think it's exciting. It's kind of nerdy and it definitely gets into the weeds, but that's what I'm most excited about, is us continuing to build these values into this technology that's so exciting.
All right, I completely agree. Well, thank you both. I'll just add that it's great to see all of this experimentation and creativity in Bitcoin. And it's important to remind, I think, myself sometimes that this really is a 10-year time horizon that we're building for. A lot of these technologies in the Bitcoin L2 space are still very early, and we don't know exactly what is going to stick yet, but just seeing all the brain drain of people coming to solve really hard problems in the Bitcoin space has been really exciting to see this past year. So looking forward to seeing where that goes. And I think with that, we're out of time. So thank you, everyone.